Hi, Sarah.
Hi, Rusty.
How are you?
I'm great. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you.
Good.
Thank you so much for joining me here.
My pleasure.
Yeah, we've talked on the phone a bunch over the last couple of years about play and risky play and licensing and all sorts of stuff, and had a good time. So I thought it would be fun to actually do a have a stop with you on the virtual book tour.
Awesome.
Yeah. So, maybe you could tell people what your job is and your title and what that means and the kind of things that you do there in Utah.
Okay, I am the program coordinator for the Child Care Licensing Program in the state of Utah. We are housed in the Utah Department of Health. My background is I have done childcare. I actually have a degree in early childhood education. I spent time in childcare. I licensed for many, many years and kind of just got pushed into my job that I have now. It was a series of meetings of, we want you to do something different. Now we're going to have you do something else. And I'm in this job now. I kind of regulate the quality for our program, and I oversee that and our consistency. And currently, I'm also administering a $5 million CARES Act grant, which has been quite a challenge through the coronavirus and everything, trying to keep our childcare providers afloat and in compliance with licensing rule through this grant. So that's kind of my job in a nutshell.
Yeah, wow. And if you weren't busy already with your job, yeah, it must have been a really challenging year. Extra stuff on your plate. Okay, so you then who is under you and who looks up to you and
So
for
I
guidance?
actually do not directly manage anybody. I
Hmm.
kind of act um, as an auditor, so I kind of am off on my own. We do have so our administrator, who's over all of childcare licensing, is my direct supervisor. Underneath him, there's me, and then he has three managers, and they manage all of our licensing staff. And we work together and try to make sure that childcare licensing in the state of Utah is functioning well and at high quality and consistency consistently. That is one of our main targets, is that we consistently regulate every childcare provider.
Yeah, yeah, I know. You hear a lot of different stories about licensing in different places where it feels inconsistent, or one center can do one thing and others can't do those things. And um, yeah, so how do you do that? Maintain consistency?
So first of all, our we used to be one of those states where, depending on who your licensor was depending on the information you were getting. And we had an audit back in 2005 where we were mandated by our lawmakers to become more consistent. So we've put lots of things in place. One of the ways that we do it is we have something called an interpretation manual. So
Oh,
we have our rules and then a manual that goes with our rules. And our interpretation manual gives the rationale for each one of our rules. And we do use the American Academy of Pediatrics Caring for Our Children book as a guideline, so that we have research based rules. And then, so it gives the rationale using caring for our children, and then it gives how we enforce those rules and how the provider is to can maintain compliance. It also lets them know the severity of how we look at each rule, and lets them know how severe the violation will be if they are out of compliance with the rule.
okay, okay,
So that's one way we do it. That's our biggest one. The other thing is our licensors specialize in the types that they license. They don't license every type in Utah. We have three groups of licensors. The first group is our center licensors. They license all of our center-based care. The second group is we call our homes licensors. They license all of our in-home childcare, so licensed family childcare. And then we have a lower regulation called residential certificate. It's not quite a full license. And then we have a group that regulates our license exempt providers, because even though they are license exempt, our legislators have passed laws that said that they still have to do a few things in order to be license exempt, one of which is run the background check through us.
Okay.
We specialize, and that helps us stay consistent with one another, because we're not trying to remember, okay, is this a center rule or is this a licensed family rule? Like, who are we doing? All of our rules are grouped together, and they're very similar based on type.
Okay.
And
Okay.
that's another way. And of course, ongoing training with our staff is another way that we do it.
Okay. All right. Sounds good. That makes sense.
Mhm.
Um, well, maybe, so here today to talk about play and risky play and how
Mhm.
that fits into childcare and goals and for child development and everything. And then we can move into specifics, with licensing and things. But maybe first just wanted to ask about risky play in your perspective of risky play and your agencies and licensing, and then we want to get into like what kind of conversations can be had with providers and licensing to talk about these things, as people are more and more interested in providing opportunities for free play and children being children, how we open things up but still, we still want to respect the
Mhm.
guidelines and regulations and things too. But first, just yeah, what's the concept, would you say, of risky play or feelings?
I think you described it well in your book, Rusty, when you said there's a difference between a hazard and a risk. And the role of licensing, first of all, the role of licensing from state to state varies based on the legislative authority that each licensing agency is given. I've
Right.
met with licensors in other states where they are allowed to regulate curriculum. In the state of Utah, we're not.
Right.
We are under the Department of Health. And so our legislative authority is basic health and safety, is what we are allowed to regulate, which falls right in line with this risky play. So,
Yeah. Yeah.
so be aware what I'm talking about today with the state of Utah may be different, say, in the state of Oregon or in the state of New
Right.
York, based on the
Yeah.
legislative authority of that licensing agency.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, but I think you did describe it very well in your book that there's a difference between a hazard and a risk. A hazard is something we know is going to cause severe injury or death. For instance, cushioning underneath stationary play equipment. We know that there needs to be adequate cushioning underneath there to prevent a severe head injury or death. We already know that. A risk is allowing the children to explore in a safe environment. And I think you explained that very well. Licensing role is to negate those hazards. It's the provider's role to make sure they take safe, healthy risk. And I think also in your book, you explain this well, is knowing your children. Okay.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I'll just throw something out there right now. There is something you discussed in great detail in your book that I, as a licenser, I cannot get behind in childcare, and that's fire. I'm not
Right.
saying children shouldn't have experiences with fire because I think they should, but
Mm-hmm.
I don't feel comfortable with it in childcare. And the reason I don't feel comfortable with it in childcare is because, first of all, I worked in childcare and I know how those ratios work sometimes. But I also live with a 5-year-old pyromaniac. And we actually joke that he's either going to grow up to be a firefighter, an arsonist, or both.
Oh boy.
And
Yep.
and we do fire with them. But when I start a fire in my backyard with my 5-year-old great nephew, I can guarantee you I have to keep my eyes on him 100% of the time because he is compelled by some internal force to burn everything in sight. So, knowing my experiences with my little guy, I
Yeah.
fear what would happen is if he was in childcare and there was a fire, because I can guarantee you the ratios that we require, somebody's going to get burned, and it just might be him because they're not going to have enough staff for one on one for him. So that's kind of that risk versus hazard. So as the licensor, I'm like, that's a pretty big hazard to have an open fire in childcare. And then that risk of knowing you have to have your eyes on this child 100% of the time, every time you have a fire going, is negating that risk. So kind of both sides of that story right there. But I think that that's the role of licensing, is to negate those hazards, and licensing rules should negate those hazards so that those children can take safe risk.
Yeah. Yeah. So how do licensors make that distinction, I guess? Especially when maybe providers are starting to allow more risky things or loose parts or messy kinds of things that maybe used to be thought of as, oh, wait, I guess with a lot of this stuff, is this best case scenario, best practice, or is this worst practice? And how do you make that distinction? Because it might look
So,
similar.
one thing we always go back to with our staff is, what rule are you going to issue the violation to? Is
Hmm.
there really a rule that prevents this?
Pointing really to, yeah, okay.
Yeah. And like I said, with us, we have an interpretation manual and we have research based rules. And so if they're coming and they're saying, I saw this, I think it's a violation of this, and we're going to say, how? How are you issuing that violation? Is there really a rule to it? So that's something that also, as providers are looking at what they want to do, they need to really be familiar with their licensing rules and say, am I violating a rule? And if they're not sure, contact your licensing staff. Contact your licensor, ask them, hey, this is what I want to do. Is will I be violating a rule if I do this?
Hmm. Hmm. I like that. So I worked so many years working with people to design natural play spaces and play spaces. And, you hear stories of people doing great things. And then at the very end, the licensor comes in and says, you're too close to the fence. We need 6 feet of the soft surfacing
Mhm.
or whatever. And it's so disheartening when if they would have talked earlier on, had that communication, some of those problems would have been solved easily. So I like that idea of right from the start communicating, talking with your licensor about what you want to do.
And I know, well, I can speak from our experience in Utah. Like I said, I can't speak for every state. And I know that a lot of licensing agencies are spread very thin. But for
Yeah.
us, we will do a consult with you. If you're saying, hey, I need to put in a new playground, can you come out and help me make sure I get it in the right spot and everything? We'd be happy to do that for you.
Hmm.
But not every, like I said, I can't speak for every state licensing agency because I do know that some are spread very, very thin. We can also do, the pandemic has led to many things with technology, and one of the things we also now do is online consults where we can get together with our technology and we can show it and we can say, okay, measure this out. Is that 6 feet?
Hmm.
You want to put in swings? What's your um, distance from the pivot point to the ground, and do you have enough space in front and in back? Those are things um, that we would do for them. But again, I can't speak for every licensing agency.
Hmm. Hmm. So how about just making that distinction for licensors to make that distinction of hazard and risk or what makes them nervous, because whenever there's risky play, we all have different thresholds and comfort levels and everything. And the goal for licensing and providers, to provide a safe environment. But what if it could give a licensor the willies to see something going on, but that there's not a rule or it's
And that's
fuzzy.
something that we can come back and address. And sometimes our answer is you got to let it go because there's not a rule to fit it.
Hmm.
And those are things that we have to, as licensors, it's hard. All of our licensors in Utah, we try to hire them with background in early childhood ed and experience, and many of them come from very high quality environments. And licensing doesn't necessarily enforce high quality environments. As I said, our legislative authority is basic health and safety. We call it the foundation for quality. We are going to be the foundation that you're going to build your quality upon. And coming from those high quality environments, we do see things that we're like, oh, why would you do that? But in reality, they're literally meeting licensing rule. That's what they're doing. Is they're meeting the rule. They're not doing anything above it. And that's life. We allow it. That's our legislative authority. And we have to learn to recognize what quality is and recognize that they're meeting licensing rule and accept that level.
Hmm.
And I see what you're also saying of, oh, I'm seeing something, I'm not sure about it. A lot of times when we we have a lot of questions come up from our licensors. And our question is, well, first of all, was anybody injured? And they're like, no. But they could be. And our response to always is, okay, if they are, and everything else was okay, the first thing we're going to look at is, where was the supervision when this went down? What were the staff doing when this child got hurt? Was this just an accident? And that happens because we all know you play, you get hurt, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or was this something that could have been prevented had a caregiver been there to prevent it? And you gave a good example in your book, Rusty. You have a picture of a caregiver leaning up against a tree while a child is swinging on a rope.
Mm-hmm.
And she's trying to prevent that child from hitting that tree, right?
Mm-hmm.
So again, where was your caregiver when the child got hurt? And we always revert back to that supervision.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's interesting in New York State where I live, and I work with a lot of providers here. It's sometimes they say it's not the rules, but it's the punishment. And then, I said this in the book that often for providers, it's not so much really what the licensors say, but it's the fear of what they're going to say. And when
Mhm.
I show slides of, kids doing, wild stuff or risky play and everything, I have to remember for the audience and people watching to take deep breaths. Nobody was hurt in the making of these kind of things, but sort of the idea that it's the fear. They might say no right away. They might think a licensor is going to say no, so they say no to the opportunities that we really know children need. But it's more like the fear of licensing versus what licensors really would say if you were communicating with them.
Yeah, and we get that here, but I also want to add in, licensing also tends to be the scapegoat for the things that the provider feels uncomfortable with.
Okay, tell me
So
about
if
that. Yeah.
so if they have something that they're feeling uncomfortable with, they might say, well, licensing will never allow this.
Yes.
And then they'll tell the staff or the parents, well, we're not going to do this because licensing won't allow it. When in reality, there's really no rule preventing that. But they're feeling uncomfortable with it. So they're going to blame us. And quite frankly, it's okay. We don't mind. It really is okay. They can use us however until somebody calls and says, hey, they told us we can't do this. And we're like, there's really not a rule preventing it.
Interesting.
But we become the scapegoat. And there's also always, I think, in the back of a business owner's head, even if they don't want to admit it, there's always this fear of liability,
Yeah.
the big L word. Liability is a bigger word than licensing. That is a bigger threat to a business than licensing. And they may look at something and say, if I allow this child to do this, there's a possibility this child can end up with a broken bone. And if that child ends up with a broken bone, are the parents going to sue me?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And where's my liability? What's going to happen to my liability insurance rates, which I may already be struggling to pay, but I'm required to have if a child gets injured in my care?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So sometimes I think that the risk is not being allowed because not so much licensing, but more there's this liability question. And then the liability question gets reverted onto, well, licensing won't allow it.
Interesting. So what do we do? What do we do about that? Because it feels like uh, that kind of fear have gotten us
Mhm.
to this point where children aren't able to play, right? The way that maybe we remember as kids, or that we think that children should be able to, and it's kind of incremental, but
Yeah.
it's those kind of fears.
And I think that is not just things like that. I mean, I think our whole society has become a fearful society. Like I said, I've got some great nephews living with me. One's 5, one's 7. And the 7-year-old, we will let him go out in our front yard and ride his scooter. He's allowed to ride it in front of our yard and then the neighbor to the north of me because I can see clear past her fence. And she's always usually out there too. So I know he's pretty safe. But he will not go outside by himself. He will not go outside the fence by himself because he's afraid somebody is going to take him.
Whoa.
Yeah. And where does that come from?
Mhm.
Well, I live in Utah, and you all know many years ago we had a girl kidnapped out of her bedroom
Hmm.
and held captive for 9 months. Children being stolen is a big deal here. And we
Mhm.
would love to say it's not, but it is. So, yeah, is there a fear for this little boy? Yeah, there is. And he won't go outside unless you're with him.
Hmm.
He'll play in the fence, but he won't play in outside the fence. And I'll allow it because we can also watch him from our window. But he won't. So when you ask, how do we solve this problem? Well, part of the problem is I think it's not just the fear of children getting hurt, but children being like really, really hurt. And that impacts how we as adults, our world's not exactly as safe as it used to be. I would love to say, go ride your bikes. I'll call you, you know, when you're done. I was that child. I could
Mhm.
go out. My mom was always telling me, go outside and play. There was 6 of us. She wanted
Wow.
quiet. Go outside
Yeah.
and play.
Go, go.
Okay. There's always kids all over the neighborhood when I was growing up. Every time you went out to play kickball until the streetlights came on. That's exactly what we did. I don't think we can do that anymore, and sadly, because our society is not allowing that to happen anymore. So how do we fix it, Rusty? I don't know. I don't live in a wooded area like you do. I would love to say go out and play in the woods. I live in an urban area, and they scream if they see a bug. I don't get that. They're little boys, but they scream if they see a bug. Um, you know, I would love that. I would love for them to be able to explore more. We have a couple parks within our neighborhood. I'd love to say just go to the park. I can't do that right now. It's not
Mhm.
where our society allows.
Mhm.
But how do we allow more risk in childcare?
Mhm.
Again, let's negate those hazards so we can allow the risk. And knowing where it's going to be. I'll give you an example of a hazard that existed, and they wanted the children to take risks, but they didn't want what was happening. I received an incident report. I think I received 3 of them in a 3-week period from the same facility of a broken arm on the outside play area.
Okay.
And when we get that many, we're calling and we're saying, hey, what's going on? And I called them and I said, I've gotten 3 broken arms in your outside play area in the past 3 weeks. What's happening? And they said, our stationary play equipment, and there's that monkey bar that goes across it that connects the 2 pieces. And I'm like, yeah, I know that piece. And she says, the school age kids are trying to jump from the platform over as far as they can onto the monkey bars. And all 3 broken arms were that.
Wow.
They
Yeah.
removed the monkey bars to prevent any more broken arms.
Hmm. Hmm. Hmm.
I don't know if that was the best solution,
Right, right.
but
Yeah.
the kids were taking risk and it
Yeah.
was costing them a lot of money.
Yeah. Yeah, well, isn't it interesting? Even with like fixed equipment, but children are they're pushing the limits and they're testing their bodies and they're trying to take things to the next level, and that's what they're supposed to do. But I mean, that's where it's like, well, fixed equipment. You hear kids get hurt that way because they're using it in ways that they weren't made for, or the surfacing doesn't provide for that kind of fall. As opposed if there was more loose stuff, or they're engaged in other ways, or taking other kinds of risks that might be safer. Like in that sense, maybe that sort of thing's a hazard.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And they had pour in place underneath their cushioning. They're not looking at poor cushioning underneath their equipment. They had high quality pour in place laid when they built this facility. That's probably why the kids were only ending up with broken arms and not more severe injuries, though,
Yeah.
as
Hmm.
well. And I agree. I think one of the things that we have sadly moved to in our society is, for some reason, we think an awesome stationary play structure is what every childcare needs, right?
Mhm.
Before I was a licenser, I used to help administer grants for our grant agency here in the state of Utah, and we would use the environment rating scales out of Chapel Hill.
Yeah. Okay.
And one thing that we quickly discovered, because one of the things that you assess on that is how many skills can be developed out on the playground.
Hmm.
Children developed more skills when they had no stationary play equipment. only
Hmm.
portable equipment than with the piece of stationary play equipment. That typically the skills being developed were the skills that applied to the piece of equipment and not to anything else. So if we could get them to purchase more portable equipment, that worked. And we had a lot of facilities who pulled off their equipment and went strictly to portable equipment. And the big wave now is towards the natural playgrounds.
Hmm.
And those are awesome. They get those risks. If they're done properly, they get the risk, but they don't have the hazards. And that's the beauty of those nature playgrounds, is that they can frequently have risk and no hazards. And children love them. They love to be able to explore on them.
Hmm. Yeah, there you're bringing the woods to the play area, to the childcare center. The yeah.
It also forces the caregivers to create an outside curriculum, which doesn't always happen when you have a piece of equipment, because
Hmm.
all of a sudden that becomes break time. You guys go play on the equipment. I'm going to sit down here and take a little rest.
That's right. Right. Yeah, it's a different mindset.
Mhm,
The play equipment, fixed thing, go play,
mhm.
versus it's an outdoor classroom. It's opportunity for, yeah, play and learning and growing. And hmm. Are providers being outside more during coronavirus in Utah?
Yeah, definitely. One of the things we funded a lot for on this grant was outdoor shade structures. We get a lot of heat here. Um, for people who don't know, Utah is a very diverse climate. We get our snow um, in the north. We have our lovely four seasons in the north. And in the south, we are very warm. We have more of an Arizona climate in the south. They say people don't leave Utah. We just migrate south as we get older.
There we go.
We go from Salt Lake to St. George um,
Yeah.
as we get older. So we have lots of opportunity to be outside. However, we do have a very strong sun here, and we had a lot of requests for shade structures so that they could spend a lot of time outside. And we are seeing a lot more outside time.
Hmm. Hmm. And has that brought any licensing issues up? Or have you seen anything come across?
Not really. We're seeing no. I don't think so. I don't think we've had any additional injury reports than we see every summer. Like we can always tell when the weather's getting warmer because the injury and incident reports always increase, and that's fine because they're going outside, they're playing harder, they're taking more risks
Hmm.
than inside.
Hmm.
I don't think we've seen any increase in that. I think that we're pretty stable. Um, I think caregivers are learning to move things outside. Um, we've had a lot of requests on these grants. As I'm administering them, I see what we're giving away. Like I said, with the shade structures, ways to wash hands outside, portable sinks for outside, um, picnic tables to sit and eat at. A lot more requests. They're asking to have their stationary play equipment replaced
Hmm.
because it's getting old, cushioning replaced, that type of thing. And they're planning on being outside more,
Hmm. That's
which
good. And
allows
it's, yeah,
for
that's
more
one
play.
of the, yeah, the interesting things about this time of,
Mhm.
and maybe caregivers are seeing that, oh, it's easier than we thought to spend more time outside, and schools that didn't go outside as much are going out more, and that it's healthier, and gee, it's fun out there, and opportunities, yeah, for curriculum and, yeah, and outdoor classroomy stuff. Huh. Besides fire in the book, were there any other things that raised some flags, or that you,
The only other thing that raised like a big red flag in my mind is you highlighted a school where they are like free flowing and they're mixing like kindergartners with high schoolers.
yeah.
And the one thing that went through my mind was, oh my goodness, that's like prime for child on child. And I was like, oh, I hope they have really good supervision going on and cameras everywhere because I don't know if I could. I've been licensing too long. Let's just put it that way.
Okay. Child on child, that's what bad things
Child on
happen.
child pedophilia. Yeah.
Okay,
Child
okay.
abuse amongst children. Hmm.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
Yeah. And when you get those white age groups, sometimes that can increase. unless there is a lot of supervision. I like the idea of it. I like the idea of having like maybe the older brother teaching the little brother
Right,
how to
right.
skateboard
Yep,
or whatever. I love
yep.
that idea. Um, but unless there's a lot of supervision or a way to really keep tabs on the kids, I kind of get a little nervous about that.
Mhm.
And again, it goes back to our society, Rusty. When you and I were growing up, did we ever hear about child on child pedophilia? Absolutely not.
Mhm.
We didn't.
Mhm. Mhm.
No, and now we know that's a thing that actually exists.
Hmm.
And it's sad. And we also know why it exists, which is even sadder. So
Hmm.
that's an unfortunate thing.
Yeah.
But other than that, I could look at everything and I could say, okay, I can see where that was going. If they, if they can make sure that the kids had a safe place to land when they landed, let's do it.
Yeah. Yeah. So, as far as age group with children, you had said earlier to me when we were talking that though in childcare, that isn't something in Utah, that the mixing of the ages.
It is. It actually is. So you quoted somebody who said that their state agency doesn't allow the mixing of ages.
Yeah.
And that floored me because first of all, what do you do first thing in the morning and late in the afternoon when kids are being picked up and you've got one child left in one room and three left in another? Why are you going to keep two staff and not mix those kids together?
Hmm.
So, no,
Makes
we
sense.
allow in the state of Utah, we allow the mixing of age groups. Absolutely, we allow that. We have thought of every possible age combination that can occur, and we have put together ratio tables for that age combination.
Oh,
And
wow.
if a child care center wants to mix their children birth through age 12, we will allow that because age 12 is our cutoff unless the child has special needs and then it's 18. We will allow that at the same ratio we allow home providers to do care. And that is a ratio of 1 to 8 with no more than two children under the age of 2.
Okay.
So if they wanted to mix those babies with older kids, they can up to 8 kids,
Yeah.
but they are only allowed two under the age of 2 unless they have a second caregiver in the group.
Yeah.
Um, but we don't see it happening very often. It is not financially advantageous for the provider to do.
Right. Right. Yeah. Huh. But you've thought it all through. I like that.
Mm-hmm.
That there's yeah, there's plans for it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right, but they need yeah, extra resources.
Yeah. And we also tell them you have to be acutely aware of how old every child is because we don't believe in almost. The child is 4 until the day the child turns 5. And when that child turns 5, then that child's a 5-year-old. So you can mix your 4s and 5s, but don't tell me, well, I have this many 4-year-olds and this many 5-year-olds, and this child's almost 5, so I'm counting him as a 5-year-old. I'm like, nope, we're still counting him as a 4-year-old.
You have to have a cutoff somewhere. Must be yeah, yeah. The actual age. Well, what would be your biggest advice to providers wanting to do more risky play or wanting to start this or try it or someone who's read my book and wants to do some of that stuff?
My advice to them was, first of all, be very, very, very familiar with licensing rule.
Okay.
And if you don't have a resource to find out how they're going to enforce that, such as our interpretation manual, you need to be in close contact with your licensing agency.
Talking to them.
Tell me, I've looked through the rules. I can't find anything that will prevent it. Please let me know if there is something else that I'm missing. But communicate. Communication is always key. And licensing, we love the questions. We love it.
Hmm.
I would rather have a provider call me every day and ask me a question about a rule. And when I go out for their inspection, get no violations, than be in an inspection issuing a violation and the provider saying, oh, I was going to ask you about that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Please talk to your licensing agency. Talk to people who you know will know. If you don't feel comfortable talking directly to your licensor, but you know that there's somebody else in the licensing agency that you feel comfortable talking to, talk to them. We don't get offended. If I have a caseload and you feel more comfortable calling my coworker and asking her questions, call and ask them questions because that's fine with me as long as you're getting it right is what matters to me.
Mm-hmm.
Keep those
Mm-hmm.
kids safe, and that's what we want.
Yeah, I think people get nervous about what licensors are going to say. What do they do? What should a provider do if they don't agree with something the licensor did or said or
Every
wrote up?
state should have an appeals process.
Hmm.
So if you are issued a rule violation and you disagree with it, you should have the right to appeal. And you just need to follow their appeals process and go through it. Everybody should have the right to appeal.
Okay. But I like that idea of like know your rules, just study the rules. And I know even in New York State, when you look at the rules, they're not all that specific. There's playground safety guidelines and those things. They have specific stuff, but a lot of the rest is a little bit more. I don't know. Maybe Utah is different, but often because it doesn't feel like there's so many specific things. It's more like supervision and a safe environment, but that some of that kind of leaves some room for interpretation.
Right. And that's where, for us, our interpretation manual really, really helps. We used to have very specific playground rules that we would quote ASTM in and say you
Mm,
have to have ASTM 1295 cushioning and all this other stuff. And we got told by our rules, the people who oversee our rules, that we actually cannot quote that in our rules. So we had to change it up a little bit because we were told we can't quote that anymore. And one of the ways that we can do it is we can write it into our interpretation manual and say, okay, if you need adequate cushioning, you need to be able to provide us documentation that it meets ASTM 1295 so that we know that it's adequate for the height of the equipment.
okay.
And or I think we actually got a little less specific than that. I think we told them that they had to provide us with head impact criteria
Okay.
for it,
Okay.
which is the 1295, the ASTM
Uh,
1295
uh,
documentation.
okay.
So I understand why you're saying that some of it's vague, Rusty, and
Yeah.
some of it may be that the rulemaking process doesn't allow us to be more specific because we are a bureaucracy and everything has to happen the bureaucratic way.
Sure. Yeah. 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 And there's so many different caregivers and providers that you have to yeah
Yeah.
be
And
working with.
and one thing also to keep in mind is a lot of times when we see people who want, they're reading your book. If they're reading your book, Rusty, they're not your baseline provider. These
Okay.
are the people who care for our kids. But when we write licensing rule, we have to write them for those baseline providers,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
not for those who are providing that developmentally appropriate care or are trying to follow best practice and are trying their best there. That's the group we love to license. Don't get me wrong. That group is easy.
Mm-hmm.
But when we write rule, we have to write it for those who maybe aren't as attentive to the kids as that group of providers are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. 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 That the basic baseline. Hmm. What's your ideal outdoor environment?
Oh,
What goes on out there?
you know, first of all, you have to know what your climate is and what your environment is. I have lived in West Virginia. So, Rusty, when you talk about going out into the forest and all of that fun stuff, I totally know what you're talking about. Like, that is ideal. I'm originally from Kansas, and that we don't have forest in Kansas.
Mm-hmm.
And I've lived most of my life in the Mountain West in Arizona and Utah. And I can guarantee you, the forests here are up in the mountains, and unless you're there, you're not getting anything. We are down here in a desert.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
So knowing what is available to you is totally different. With all the logs and everything you talk about, the logs and the twigs and everything, I have one tree in my yard, and it's a pine tree.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I have had to cut down some trees in my yard because they got diseased. The neighbor to the west and to the north of me has cut down all of their trees for disease because we have a fungus that naturally occurs in our soil here. We have no more trees left, except I do have my pine tree in my front yard. I don't know if I have access to twigs anymore. These are things that you have to know what your environment is. So for me, I have to be honest with you, if I had to put together a perfect environment
Yeah.
for kids, okay, and I'm going to use my backyard for an example because right now my backyard is dirt.
Okay.
I'm also going to get feedback from my little 5-year-old who attends a preschool at a college, and they actually have 3 playgrounds. They have a natural playground, they have a playground with a structure, and then they have a playground that is like a big green space with a playhouse on it, like the coolest playhouse you've ever seen in your life. And he calls it the castle.
Mm-hmm. Nice.
And he loves all 3 playgrounds. And I have to be honest with you, I kind of would like a mix myself. I
Mm-hmm.
would love to have a green space with a castle on it and a play structure if they want to go play on the play structure. And at the same time, I would like to have a little space similar to a natural playground with a shade structure on it and a place where we can. Okay, this is my backyard. Again, I don't feel super comfortable in childcare because of ratios. My fire pit on it.
Yeah.
I'm not opposed to children having experiences with fire. I'm having angst with it happening in daycare, um, or in childcare.
Yes.
So these are things that I would love to see is actually a mix, because I think if you got a mix going, you would really be able to um, help those children develop those skills. So
Mm-hmm.
that's my
Mm-hmm.
ideal space, is kind of a little mix. And maybe your play structure, your stationary play structure, is a natural structure. Maybe
Mm-hmm.
it's a monkey bridge,
Mm-hmm.
which I've never been able to master. I'm going to tell you that right now. The monkey bridge is not my forte.
What's a monkey bridge? What do you call it, a monkey bridge?
A monkey bridge is a rope bridge, and it has a big rope that runs along the bottom, and then you have two
Oh yeah.
ropes that run along the top, and then you lash them together with smaller ropes in between. You have to kind of balance on the rope and
Yeah.
go across them.
Yeah. Yeah. I could see myself falling off one of those.
They're fun and they're hilarious to do, but I've never gotten completely across one.
Well, don't give up. Keep trying, Sarah.
You see them a lot at scout camps. I'm going to tell you that right now.
Yeah. Yeah. I can picture that. Yeah. Ropes courses.
Yeah, I experienced it at a camp for girls, but I see it a lot with the Boy Scout camps.
Okay. Cool. Cool. Well, thank you so much, Sarah. I appreciate talking to you about all this. It's a lot to think about. You have this broad perspective of, we as individuals and individual providers, we just have our own perspective. But, you have it across the state and through time. And, you see the good, the bad, and the ugly. And that idea of wanting to just kind of have that baseline of like, okay, we want kids just basically safe
Mhm.
in general. And then from there, how do we have building blocks to create the great opportunities and the best practice kinds of things?
Right, right, as a licenser, people looking at reading your book and they're saying, "Oh, my licensing agency would never allow this." Ask them, call them, and say, "Hey, I just read this fabulous book about children in risk by Rusty Keeler, and I would like to do this. Would there be a licensing rule that would prevent me from doing this?"
Hmm. Hmm.
And they'll find out.
Yeah, I like that. And that was kind of a goal for me with the book of like it's just to kind of get the imagination going and start conversations,
Mhm.
start the discussions. And maybe even for those people that have using licensing as a scapegoat, like licensor wouldn't let me do this. Well, maybe they could, they'll think about it differently and want to do stuff. And then they'll know that, well, my licensing actually will let me do this, or maybe
Right.
people will be surprised.
Yeah, and one thing also is, even if licensing says it's okay and you're still not comfortable with it, that's probably means you shouldn't be doing it. Because if you're not comfortable with it, it's just going to interfere with that risk.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
you're going to offer it and it's going to be there, and then you're going to freak out when it happens.
Yeah.
And internally you're going to be, "No, no, no, don't do that. Don't do that."
Yeah.
And so you have to have your comfort level too, and maybe what needs to happen is you need to slowly move into risk.
Yes.
Don't go straight from, um, saying, I'm not allowed to have fire at my center because licensing won't allow it, only to discover that you don't have a rule preventing that. Now, let me just tell you, in the state of Utah, we do. We have a rule preventing any open flame. Um, so, um, you don't go if you find out there's not a rule preventing it. You probably don't want to go straight to let's build a bonfire.
Yeah. Yeah. Small steps, baby steps.
Yeah,
Yeah.
find out if you're comfortable with it. Find out if you really trust your children with it. Find out if you trust your staff with it,
Hmm.
and then move slowly towards that. But don't. I wouldn't advise reading the book and then just saying, "Oh, I love all these ideas. I'm going to jump right into it because I don't have any licensing rules preventing it." You might cause yourself to have a heart attack. Take those baby steps a little bit at a time.
Yeah. Yeah. And, I have people be like, we just say yes all the time now, just like you say. And I'm like, no, no, you still need to think it all out. And every day's different. And I'm not saying say yes to everything. And it doesn't mean take
Yeah.
a break. Yeah.
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 I have my 7-year-old great nephew who would love for me to say yes all the time. In fact, he says, when I'm a dad, I'm going to let my kids do whatever they want. And I tell him, no, you're not, because you're going to love your kids and you're going to want them to be safe, and you're going to help them be safe by putting parameters around them to keep them safe. Saying
That's,
yes to risk is not saying yes to everything.
that's right. That's right. Okay. Well, my last little thing, let me ask you about the Utah Free Range Kids Act, right? Didn't that happen 2 years ago? The Utah state passed that said you're a free range state.
Oh my goodness, I can't even remember what that bill is right now, Rusty.
Yeah, I think it was saying that, again, the parents, not they won't get in trouble for allowing their children to go out
Oh,
and
okay, I
about.
remember
Yeah,
this bill now.
yeah, yeah.
Sorry. We're in another legislative session right now, so
Whole
taking
different
me
things on
out
the
of this
table.
legislative session is a little bit hard. No, I
Yeah,
remember that. So the bill was that um, child protective services, like if children were just riding their bikes through the neighborhood or going to the park to play by themselves, you can't call child protective services and say these kids are just running wild.
yeah.
That's not what it is. And that bill prevented that from happening, although our Child Protective Service Agency said it really wasn't happening. So they passed the bill, but our CPS agency could not find any cases where it actually, to my knowledge, okay, so to my knowledge, from my memory, could not find any cases where it's happened. And I have to be honest with you, in my neighborhood, we have had to call the police on a couple kids, but again, they were 3 years old and nobody knew where they went.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
And so that they do get involved in. They will get involved. If your 3-year-old is running through the neighborhood and nobody knows who they belong to, and the police get called in, CPS will show up at your door. But just allowing your kids to play freely, we will allow.
Mm-hmm.
But again, Rusty, it goes back to how much do the parents feel comfortable doing that these days?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I mean, maybe that legislation was just another way to reinforce, like, saying that, to try to open things up a little and, take away a little bit of the fears or just normalize it somewhat.
Yeah, and also like I said, we're a very diverse state, and probably a little similar. You being from New York State, because I've talked to people in New York State, they can say this too. We have very strongly populated urban areas, condensed in one area, and then the rest of the state is pretty rural.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And I think that people coming from those rural areas into these urban areas are like, oh, they can still do everything. And those of us who've lived in the urban areas for years are like, what are you talking about? Why are you letting your kids do that? Don't you know children get kidnapped out of their rooms,
Mm-hmm.
out of
Mm-hmm.
their backyards? We had a little girl kidnapped out of her backyard and killed, sadly. So it's these are things that we deal with. And in the rural areas, they're like, well, we know everybody.
Yeah,
There's 500 people in my town. I know everyone. I let my kids go everywhere they want because somebody's going to call and say, hey, your kid's over here.
yeah, yeah. 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 Different, very different scenarios.
Yeah, and I think you guys probably experienced that a little bit in New York too, throughout the state.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I'm upstate and it's rural. I'm in a little city, but it's a small city. And yeah, so, you have the country kids that are out, getting into it all. And then cities that are, yeah, a little tighter, a little tougher. Yeah.
Yeah, and also I think that's where community comes in too. I have just a few doors down from me a family with 3 boys with autism on
Okay.
different
Well,
levels of autism.
okay.
And I really admire these parents. They try their best to give these children the best experience of childhood that they can. And one of the things that they do is they will let these boys with autism ride their scooters throughout the neighborhood.
Hmm.
And one of the reasons they can do it is because every time these boys are riding their scooters through the neighborhood, she'll get a series of texts that will say, "Hey, this child is down at by my house. Are we okay, or do we need to send him home?"
Hmm. Hmm.
And
Hmm.
she'll be like, "Nope, send him home," or "Yeah, no, he's fine." You know?
I like that because that does talk to community. The idea of it takes a village. The idea of knowing your neighbors. The idea of, yes, a few things bad happen, and we've heard about those stories and all this. But like, okay, well, how do we communicate? How do we talk to the people around us, and how do we make it a safe environment as we can today? And still be vigilant, still be mindful of things that could happen, but the idea if we're all working together and we're looking out for each other, the way that humans have always, when we've always lived in groups, and how to bring that back, that it's not just the terrible thing you see on the TV and that kind of stuff, but like what happens outside your door, and we want to look out for each other, and if that's like part of the solution to open things up again, to allow children to have a little bit more play, how do we do that? And,
Mhm.
is it even like having excuses to have block parties so that people can just get out of their houses when
COVID
when
is
we
over.
can, when we're not in a global pandemic? Uh, but yeah, I think that's a big part of it. Yeah.
Yeah, and to relate that back to childcare, we have home providers and do care out of their homes, and again, they need to follow the rules there. And but also in centers, know your staff, know what your staff feel comfortable with,
Hmm.
and you don't want to sit back and say, "Okay, we're going to allow this risk" when your staff are not feeling comfortable with it, because that may not be the safest thing for the kids.
Yeah,
If
that's right.
if you can't get on board with if you can't get everybody on board, it may not be the safest environment. That may become the hazard.
Hmm.
That
Hmm.
may be the hazard to the risk, is that the staff are not prepared to let the kids take the risk.
Yeah, yeah. It's not all of a sudden just saying anything goes. It's
Mhm.
conversations,
Mhm.
conversations, conversations.
And Rusty, one thing about the programs you highlighted in your book, these were people who sat and thought things through, and
Mhm.
they developed curriculums and they developed programs from research and from experience. They didn't just throw them into it,
Yeah, yeah.
and that's important. Again, that goes back to talking to all your stakeholders, your parents, your licensing agency, your staff, everyone. What do we feel comfortable with? Sometimes your liability insurance, because there's rules. We sometimes get told, well, I can't do that because you guys won't let me. And we're like, no. And she's like, we talked to somebody. And I'll say, by any chance, did you talk to your liability insurance? And they'll be like, oh yeah, that's who told us we couldn't do it.
Hmm.
So get all your stakeholders on board. Make sure your hazards are gone. Take care of the hazards, and then let the risk happen.
Yeah. Amen. Say it again. Yeah. All right. Well, that's perfect place to end there, Sarah. Thank you so much. Yeah, I'd like to keep this conversation going, and maybe we could circle around. Maybe we could have like a risk roundtable with licensing people and some providers, and I just think that having these conversations is it's good to dispel myths, but also talk about baby steps or how to start or what it all means for people. Yeah. Yeah. All
Well, it was
right.
a pleasure, Rusty. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. And let's keep in touch.
All right, will
Yeah.
do.
All
All
right.
right.
Bye.